During dinner, my granddaughter rolled her eyes, pushed her plate back, and said, "What could you possibly know about sports? You're just an old man." The words cut deeper than she could ever imagine. The room fell into that heavy silence where laughter had no place, yet no one came to your defense. Forks scraped against plates, eyes shifted, and the conversation stumbled forward as though nothing had happened. But to you, it wasn't nothing. It was the echo of a truth you had feared for years, that in your own home, among your own family, your name had turned into a ghost. You looked at her, your granddaughter, the child you once carried on your shoulders to playgrounds, the one who once clapped when you tossed a ball gently into her tiny hands. Now she sat across from you, grown, certain, convinced. She had already measured you and found you lacking. To her, you were not a man who had lived battles, not an athlete who had bled for the game, not someone whose picture still hung in gyms she had never visited. To her, you were just a bent figure at the table, hands rough with age, eyes too slow to follow the speed of her world. She didn't know the hours you had run in rain, lungs burning, chasing victories that weren't just yours but belonged to entire teams, to entire towns. She didn't know the taste of blood in your mouth after a hard hit, the feeling of the crowd rising like thunder, the way victory can lift a broken body high enough to forget pain. She didn't know because no one had told her. And perhaps that was the cruelest part, not her words, but the silence of those who should have passed your story down. So you sat there, holding her gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet heaviness that no one else could read. She rolled her eyes again, dismissive, certain her world was brighter, faster, more real than yours had ever been. She thought you were nothing more than a shadow at the table. And in that moment, you understood something the world had forgotten. Not just the world out there with its flashing screens and new champions, but the world at your very table. The home you had hoped would carry your story forward had let it slip through their fingers. But the truth, you knew, has its own way of rising. It waits in silence, carved into walls, frozen in photographs, etched into trophies and records. The truth never needs to shout. It simply waits for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. And one day, sooner than your granddaughter could imagine, the walls themselves would speak, the gym would whisper your name, and the same eyes that rolled with arrogance would widen in disbelief when the truth she had buried beneath her laughter stared back at her from the Hall of Fame. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to light. And now, let's continue. She leaned back in her chair, her voice laced with the careless certainty of youth. It's not like you ever really played. Not for real. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, and the ripples reached you long before anyone else dared to move. For her, it was a joke. An offhand dismissal meant to assert her world over yours. For you, it was a dagger, sharp, not because of the cruelty, but because of the silence that followed. You stared at your plate, the food untouched, and thought of how many times those very hands, now veined and slower, had once lifted weights heavier than your granddaughter could imagine. You thought of the mornings you woke up with joints screaming, but still laced your shoes. You thought of the nights you came home bleeding, bones bruised, and still woke up the next day to do it again. You thought of the crowd, its roar, its faith, its belief in you. And now, sitting in the same room as your own family, you realized that roar had become a whisper lost to time. The room carried on around you, but every sound felt distant. You could hear the clatter of dishes, the low hum of half-hearted conversation, but beneath it all was the throb of those words, pulsing like a wound you couldn't close. You never really played, not for real. You wanted to laugh, not from amusement, but from the bitter irony of it. How easy it is, you thought, for those who live in comfort to mock the sweat that built the ground they walk on. How quick the young are to dismiss what they've never had to fight for. But you did not laugh. You sat still with the dignity that years of discipline had built into your spine. And yet, inside you, something shifted. You were no longer simply enduring the forgetfulness of your family. You were bearing witness to it. Their silence spoke louder than her words. To them, your victories were gone, erased, forgotten. But you knew one truth that silence could never cover. History has its own voice. It waits, and when it speaks, it doesn't need anyone's permission. You lifted your eyes, just for a moment, and looked at your granddaughter. She didn't notice. She was already lost in her phone, scrolling through pictures of athletes she admired, faces that shone with the glow of the present. She didn't know that once, people looked at you the same way. She didn't know that the game she claimed you never really played had once bent under the weight of your name. And in that moment, you did not feel anger. You felt patience, because life has a way of turning silence into an echo. And you knew, whether tomorrow or a year from now, or in the quiet hall of a gym where the walls carry more memory than the people inside it, her words would meet their answer. The silence that followed that dinner was heavier than the words themselves. Silence has a way of saying what mouths refuse to admit, and that night it roared louder than any insult. My cousin's remark had cut me, yes, but the deeper wound came from the ones who sat nearest to me, those who should have stood, who should have said something, who should have defended me not because I needed protection, but because I deserved truth. Instead, they chose stillness. Their eyes dropped to their plates, their hands busied themselves with bread and glasses, and in that avoidance I heard their verdict. They agreed, maybe not in their hearts, maybe not consciously, but in that moment their silence confirmed it. My labor was something less. My life, in their eyes, was not a legacy, but a tool they had already put away. It wasn't the laughter of strangers that cut you. It was the silence of blood, the quiet dismissal in your granddaughter's eyes, the way her parents shifted in their chairs but never spoke in your defense. Respect doesn't always vanish in storms. Sometimes it fades like sunlight behind thick clouds, gradually, until one day you realize you are sitting in darkness, and no one even noticed the light was gone. You looked at the faces around you and saw a truth you didn't want to admit. To them, you were no longer the man who once stood undefeated, the man whose body had been a wall, whose name had filled stadiums. To them, you were just an old man whose stories felt too distant, whose memories belonged to another era, whose place at the table was tolerated, not honored. You felt the sting of that realization sink into your chest, not as anger, but as grief, because the generation that should have carried your story forward had chosen to bury it instead. In their eyes, you had become a relic, a photograph yellowing in a drawer, a story too worn to tell. Your hands, once strong enough to hold victory, were seen only as fragile, trembling things. Your voice, which once commanded entire teams, now felt unheard even in your own kitchen. You were not invisible to the world. You were invisible at home. And that was the cruelest silence of all. But deep inside, beneath the ache of being forgotten, you felt another truth stirring. Respect may fade in living rooms. It may falter at dinner tables. But it cannot be erased from the places where history has already carved your name. The game remembers. The walls remember. The trophies in glass cases remember. Even if your family had forgotten, the world had not. And one day, the two would collide. Your hidden legacy meeting their blind disbelief. You let the silence linger that night, not out of surrender but out of patience, because you knew something they didn't. Respect may vanish from the lips of those too young to understand it, but it always waits in the corners of time. ready to return when truth can no longer be ignored. And when that moment came, when your granddaughter would finally see your face, not as an old man at her table, but as a figure immortalized in the Hall of Fame, you knew the sting of this fading respect would turn into the sweetest justice. You did not argue with her. You did not raise your voice or pound your fist against the table, demanding they remember who you once were. Instead, you carried the silence, letting it settle on your shoulders like a medal too heavy to wear proudly anymore, a medal no one else could see. That silence was not weakness. It was the weight of years, of battles fought long ago, of victories no one in that room had witnessed but which still pulsed in your bones like echoes of a song that refuses to die. I listened to their words, sometimes even nodded, though each syllable weighed against me like a stone in my chest. They carried themselves like kings, but I could see the hollowness beneath it. Their victories were numbers on paper, fleeting, fragile, subject to the rise and fall of tides they did not control. My victories stood against storms. My victories carried families across rivers on bridges I helped raise, carried children into classrooms inside schools I had laid brick by brick, carried the sick into hospitals where beams I had bolted held firm above their beds. Their laughter could dismiss me, but their world still leaned on mine, though they pretended not to notice. So you bore the silence? You let their glances slide past you as if you were a shadow? Let their laughter circle around the table without touching you? Let their dismissal ring in the air unanswered? Not because you had nothing to say, but because the truth did not need your defense. The truth was already carved in time, etched into walls, engraved in halls where your face still hung, waiting. Still, that silence pressed heavy against your chest. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exile, being in the same room with those you love, yet feeling as though you were already gone. Every bite of food was tasteless, every sound muffled, every moment stretched long and empty. You were surrounded by your own family, and yet you felt like a stranger at their table. That was the heaviest part. Not that they had forgotten, but that they lived as though there was nothing worth remembering. You carried that silence out of the house that night, like a stone in your pocket, unspoken but unmovable. And as you sat alone, later, staring at your hands, you traced the scars that no one else cared to notice. Each mark told a story of a game survived, a fight endured, a moment where you refused to fall. They were medals, too, earned not from gold or silver, but from flesh and bone. But to them, they were just wrinkles, just time. And yet, deep within that silence, there was also patience. A stillness that knew the world has a way of revealing what people choose to ignore. You had seen it before. Names forgotten, then resurrected. Faces dismissed, then honored again when the truth could no longer be denied. You knew that silence, heavy as it was, would not last forever, because sooner or later the world always remembers what deserves to be remembered. And when it did, you would not need to speak a single word. I remembered the long nights on the riverbank, cold mud clutching my boots as we drove the foundations of a bridge deep into the earth. We worked with lanterns burning low, the water biting at our ankles, but we stayed until the pilings stood firm against the current. Months later, when the bridge finally opened, I stood in the distance and watched a boy on a bicycle ride across it for the first time, his laughter carried by the wind. No one clapped for me. No one spoke my name. But I knew. That laughter was my monument. That child's freedom was my reward. I remembered the school, a patch of land where weeds grew higher than a man's waist. We cleared it with our hands, sweat stinging our eyes, backs bent under the weight of timber and stone. And when the walls rose, when the bell tower finally stood, the sound of that first bell echoed across the valley. Children ran in, clutching books too big for their arms, eyes wide with a kind of wonder you cannot buy with money. I watched from the shadows, leaning against the fence, invisible. But inside me, something swelled that no applause could equal. Because I knew I had not just built a building, I had built a future. You still followed the game. You watched from your living room as new athletes rose, some stumbling where you once stood firm, others shining in ways that reminded you of yourself. But when the commentators spoke, when they told stories of the sport's legacy, your name was never there. They built a history of the game without you in it, as though the bridges you carried on your shoulders had simply appeared on their own. And every time they spoke of great moments, every time they listed names, a part of you ached, not for fame, but for truth, for acknowledgement that you had once given your body, your youth, your very soul to the game they loved. Even your family absorbed that silence, repeating the world's forgetting as if it were fact. Your granddaughter, too young to have seen you play, had only ever heard scraps of memory. And even those scraps had grown thin, fragile, worn down by the lack of pride in the voices that told them. Without stories, without reminders, even the brightest flame fades. She looked at you and saw not the man who had once filled stadiums, but just an old man with fading strength and eyes that stared too long at the past. And yet you knew the truth. The sport itself had not forgotten. The lines of the field still carried the echo of your footsteps. The records, though buried under new numbers, still bore your name. The archives, dusty and ignored, still held footage of nights when you made the impossible real. Memory is a fragile thing in the hands of people, but in the bones of a game, in the walls of a hall, in the photographs sealed in frames, it cannot be erased. So you carried the weight of being forgotten, just as you once carried the weight of expectation on your shoulders before a roaring crowd. It was a different kind of burden, quieter, lonelier, but heavy all the same, and you bore it with the same endurance, the same grit that once made you who you were. Because deep down you knew, history has a way of circling back, and one day, when the right eyes opened and the right voices spoke, the world that forgot would be forced to remember. And when that day came, your granddaughter would no longer roll her eyes. She would see. She would understand. In the corner of the old school gym, far from the polished trophy cases and the glossy posters of current athletes, there hangs a board that most people pass by without notice. Its wood has darkened with age, its edges chipped and worn, but it holds faces, faces that once carried the pride of generations. And there, among the yellowing photographs, is yours. Not grand, not in gold, not glowing under a spotlight, but steady, weathered, stubbornly alive. The photo stares out with a younger version of your eyes, the fire still burning, the jaw set with the hunger of a man who would not be denied. You are frozen in time, caught in a moment when sweat was honor and every bruise was another line in your story. The students who run down the hallway barely look at it. To them, it's just old paper behind scratched glass, another relic from a past they can't imagine. But the walls remember. The echoes of footsteps, the roar of the crowd that once filled those bleachers. They all remember. Your granddaughter has walked past that hallway countless times, never slowing, never caring. She laughs with her friends, clutching her books, too busy with the present to give the past a glance. To her, those faces on the wall are strangers, forgotten men and women whose time has passed. She doesn't know that one of those strangers is blood, her name, her own legacy hiding in plain sight. And yet, every time someone brushes past that board, the silence feels heavier, as though the picture itself is waiting, waiting for eyes to see, waiting for voices to remember, waiting for truth to step out from behind the shadows. The gym may have changed, the coaches may be different, the lights may shine brighter now, but that photograph is still there, patient and unyielding. It doesn't beg for attention, it doesn't shout, it simply exists, proof carved into memory that cannot be erased, no matter how long people look away. You haven't stood in front of it for years, but if you did, you would feel the pull of every heartbeat you left on that court. You would remember the noise of victory, the pain of loss, the smell of the wood floor after hours of sweat. That photograph is more than paper. It is a doorway to a truth buried under indifference. It whispers to anyone who dares to listen. This mattered. He mattered. One day, That board will catch the right pair of eyes, and when it does, the silence that has weighed on you for so long will finally break. Because even when the world forgets, walls remember, and walls cannot lie. Those words never reached the broadcasters, never filled the airwaves, but they filled something inside me that had been hollowed out by silence. Because I knew the truth. A name written in headlines fades, but a name spoken with respect by men who bled beside you is carved into eternity. These men remembered the night I climbed the scaffold when the winds howled like wolves, when the entire frame shuddered and everyone else froze in terror. I had moved without hesitation, tightening cables with frozen hands, anchoring the structure when it could have fallen into the river and taken us with it. They never forgot. Even years later, the story lived in their voices, but those whispers never reached your granddaughter's ears. They floated like ghosts above her, woven into a fabric of history she did not yet see. She walked past those teachers, past that old display case, past the hallway where time had tried to bury your story, and she heard nothing. To her, the world was now, not then. And so the words lived only in the air between the elders, half remembered but never forgotten. One of them, an old coach with a stoop in his back, sometimes stopped by the wall of photos. He would stand silently, staring at your face behind the glass, his lips moving with words no one else could hear. He remembered the night the crowd thundered your name, the night when no one believed victory was possible, until you dragged the team across the finish line with sheer willpower. To him, your legacy was not dust. It was alive, etched in every memory of that game. And yet, the students rushing through the hall paid no attention, as if greatness could be erased simply by refusing to look. And yet, there is also power in those whispers. They linger, they persist, they refuse to die, because truth cannot be erased entirely. Even if your granddaughter had never heard them, even if she thought you were nothing more than an old man with tired eyes and slow steps, the day was coming when those whispers would no longer stay hidden. The walls were patient, the photo was patient, and the voices were waiting for the right moment. One day they would speak not just to each other, but to her. And when that moment came, the eye roll that once stung so sharply would fade into something else, recognition. And from recognition would come something even stronger, pride. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day when practice felt endless and the air in the gym was thick with sweat and routine. Your granddaughter jogged with her teammates down the corridor, laughing, tossing casual remarks, her mind already ahead to the drills that awaited them. She had passed that hallway countless times, eyes fixed on the floor, her thoughts too young, too fast to notice the old wood paneling and fading frames on the wall. But that day, her coach stopped walking. His whistle hung silent on his chest. He turned, eyes narrowing with something that wasn't discipline, but memory. The word landed like a stone thrown into still water. Legend. It echoed in the silence, rippling outward, reaching ears that had never thought of you as anything but Grandpa, a man too slow to keep up, too quiet to matter. Your granddaughter froze. At first, she didn't understand. She blinked at the picture, her breath catching. The lines of the face in the frame, so much younger, fiercer, were familiar. They were yours. Her blood. The blood she had so carelessly dismissed. The coach looked straight at her then, his expression both stern and kind, as if he were handing her a truth too heavy to carry all at once. "This is your family," he said softly, but with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "This man carried this school on his shoulders. This man gave us victories that built our name. Every banner you play under, it began with him." His voice cracked just slightly, Not from weakness, but from the weight of respect. The teammates looked at her, surprise written across their faces. A few of them whispered among themselves, eyes darting from her to the photo, connecting the dots. In that moment, her cheeks burned, not with shame toward you, but with shame toward herself, for the roll of her eyes, for the careless words she had thrown at the dinner table, for every time she had dismissed the man whose shadow stretched far larger than she ever imagined. The walls, the photos, the whispers of old coaches, they had all been waiting for this moment. The truth had slept long enough, and now, in a single sentence, it woke. The gym did not feel the same anymore. Neither did she. Because once you hear the word legend tied to your blood, you can never look away again. She stepped closer to the glass, as though her eyes might be playing tricks on her. The hum of the gym behind her faded. The giggles of her teammates blurred into nothing. All she could see was that photograph, yellowed at the edges, but still alive in its gaze. The young man staring back wore the same eyes she had seen across the dinner table her whole life. They were sharper then, filled with fire instead of fatigue, but unmistakable. They were yours. Her chest tightened. The name engraved beneath the picture, etched in bold letters, was the same name she signed on every homework assignment. The same name she carried without ever asking where it came from. But here it was different. Here it was not just a surname, it was a monument. A name that had once been cheered from the bleachers, carved into trophies, whispered with awe. Her breath caught as heat rose to her face. All at once, every dismissive gesture, every roll of her eyes, every careless word, came crashing back like a wave. She had thought you were just a man fading into the background of old age, just a relic sitting quietly in a chair. But the photo showed her something else entirely, a fighter, a champion, a leader whose story had built the very floor she now practiced on. Shame spread through her like wildfire, burning hotter than any punishment could. It was not the shame of being scolded, it was the shame of realizing the truth too late. How many times had you sat silently at family dinners while she ignored you? How many times had you swallowed her indifference because you knew one day somehow the truth would speak louder than you ever could? And here it was, staring back at her from behind the glass. Her teammates nudged each other, whispering her name with new weight, glancing between her and the photo as the resemblance became undeniable. She felt their eyes on her, but they didn't matter. What mattered was that she was finally seeing you for the first time, not as the frail grandfather she had dismissed, but as the man who had carved history into these walls with sweat and willpower. She reached out, almost unconsciously, her fingers brushing the glass where your face shone through. For a moment she imagined the roar of the crowd, the banners waving, the pride that must have filled the room when your name was called. And she realized the cruelest part. You had never told her. You had carried your silence like a medal no one else cared to see, while she laughed at what she thought was emptiness. Her eyes stung as the weight of recognition sank in. This wasn't just a photo on a wall. This was a mirror, reflecting not only your glory but her blindness. And for the first time she bowed her head, not out of defeat, but out of respect. The gym was no longer just a place for practice. The air shifted, heavy with something she had never felt before. Weight, history, presence. The sound of bouncing basketballs slowed, sneakers squeaking against the polished wood grew faint, and in their place rose a chorus of whispers. At first, scattered and uncertain, but then growing, spreading like ripples across still water. "That's her grandfather?" one boy murmured, his voice cracking with surprise. Another leaned closer to the photo, eyes widening as though seeing a ghost brought to life. "No way! That's him? The one who carried the team through the finals? The one they still talk about?" Soon the whispers wove together into a single thread, all pointing back to her, all carrying a strange and unfamiliar weight. Her cheeks burned, but not with shame this time. It was something heavier, harder to name. Pride, but not hers. A pride she hadn't earned yet, one that felt foreign resting on her shoulders. It was the pride of others, the awe of those who had never dismissed you, who had always known the truth, even when she chose to ignore it. They looked at her differently now, not with mockery, not with indifference, but with a new respect that almost hurt to carry. The irony carved itself deep. She remembered too vividly the times she had mocked your silence, the way she had waved off your presence as if it were nothing more than background noise. Now, standing beneath the gaze of your younger self, with the gym buzzing with your legend, she felt the crushing reversal of roles. Once, it was you who bore the weight of her scorn, sitting quietly while she laughed. Now it was she who bent under the weight of respect, respect borrowed from your name, your victories, your sacrifices. The coach said nothing more, and he didn't need to. His silence echoed louder than any speech, his single gesture to the photo enough to redraw the lines of her world. Around her, the sound of dribbling returned. Sneakers slapped the floor again, but the whispers never fully died. They lingered, hanging in the rafters, following her like shadows. And she, for the first time, lowered her head. Not out of embarrassment, but in reverence. She realized that in this place, your name was not forgotten. It still moved lips, still pulled eyes, still commanded attention. The Hall of Fame was not a graveyard. It was a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, she finally heard you, not the old man at the dinner table, but the champion who once shook these very walls. The gym, alive with echoes, had become your voice, and she, standing in its center, could no longer look away. At home, you sat in your chair by the window, the same chair worn smooth by years of quiet evenings. The house was still, the ticking clock on the wall louder than any voice. You didn't know what was happening across town, in the gym where your photo still held its place on the wall like a sentinel of memory. You had no idea that, while you sat in silence, your story was speaking for you. You didn't need to be there. That was the quiet miracle of legacy. It travels without permission. It moves even when the body has long stopped running. While you stirred your tea with hands that once clenched trophies, while your back curved slightly with age, somewhere else your younger self was still standing tall. Your face, frozen in that frame, was telling a story louder than your mouth ever could. And justice, long delayed, had begun to move in its own slow rhythm. You weren't there to defend yourself at the dinner table when laughter cut deeper than knives. You weren't there when your granddaughter rolled her eyes, dismissing you as nothing more than an old man who never understood her world. But you didn't need to fight. The walls of that gym had carried your truth like a sealed letter, waiting for the right moment to be opened. And now, opened at last, your truth had spilled into her world. In her silence, as she stared at that photo with eyes wide and trembling, a part of you lived again. Every practice that left you breathless, every drop of sweat that hit the hardwood, every bruise that turned your skin purple, all of it was alive in her shame, in her recognition, in her stunned stillness. She was discovering who you were without you saying a word. There is a strange kind of justice that does not roar, but hums quietly, until the right ear finally hears it. It doesn't arrive in courtrooms or through arguments. It arrives in the unmovable presence of truth. Tonight, justice lived on a dusty wall in a school gym, in a faded photograph that carried the weight of memory no one could erase. And you, unaware, sat by the window watching the street lamps flicker on, listening to the distant hum of life outside your home. You thought you had been forgotten. You thought your time was gone. But even in that stillness, even in your solitude, the truth you carried had found its way back into the world. Your granddaughter was learning what you had always known, that silence is not weakness. Silence can be justice, waiting patiently until the right moment comes to reveal itself. And now, in the echo of that gym, your silence had finally spoken. That evening, the house breathed with a different silence. Usually, when your granddaughter came in, her presence filled the air with careless noise. Her voice quick, her steps sharp, her phone screen brighter than her eyes. But tonight the door closed gently behind her. Her laughter didn't echo down the hall. There was no sarcastic sigh, no roll of the eyes, just the soft rhythm of hesitant footsteps approaching the room where you sat. You didn't look up right away. Years had taught you patience. You stirred your tea, let the spoon circle slowly, and waited for whatever weight she carried in with her. And then you felt it. Her gaze, heavy, searching, not with arrogance, but with something unfamiliar, something trembling. You raised your eyes, and for the first time in years, she wasn't looking down at you as if you were smaller than her world. She was looking up, quietly, as if she needed something from yours. Her mouth didn't form an apology. She didn't know how yet. Words had been her weapons, and weapons are hard to put down. But her silence told its own story. It was the silence of someone who had seen too much, someone who had heard a truth louder than any boast. You could almost hear the echo of that gym in her footsteps, the whispers of her teammates asking, "That's your grandfather?" You could feel the weight of her coach's finger pointing to that wall, to your face, to your name. That truth had walked home with her, and now it stood in the room between you both. You didn't rush to comfort her. You didn't press for acknowledgement. Instead, you sat in the dignity of your years, in the chair that had seen you through storms fiercer than this one. The roles had shifted, no longer the old man dismissed by a careless glance, no longer the relic ignored at the table. Tonight, she was the one small before you, her pride cracked, her certainty shaken, and you, though wounded so many times before, found no desire for revenge. Her eyes shimmered with questions she didn't know how to ask. How could she have missed the truth for so long? How could she have mocked the very blood that gave her the legs to run, the arms to lift, the spirit to compete? Her silence begged you for patience, for forgiveness, for a bridge she couldn't yet build with words. And in your stillness, you gave it to her, not through speeches or rebuke, but through presence. Sometimes dignity is not loud. It doesn't demand recognition. It waits. And tonight, it was your granddaughter who broke under its quiet weight. She stood there, hesitant, fragile, the same child who once laughed at you, now standing in the shadow of a truth she could not undo. And for the first time, you saw not defiance in her face, but humility, not dismissal, but a longing to be near you, not above you, not beyond you, but near. And though the room was quiet, though no apology crossed her lips, you knew something had shifted forever. The girl who left in mockery had returned carrying shame. The girl who once thought you were nothing had come back searching for the man whose name still lived on walls, in trophies, in whispers, and now, in her own blood. That night, without a single word spoken, justice had taken one more step forward. It came so softly you almost thought you had imagined it. A whisper, not louder than the ticking of the clock in the next room. "I'm sorry, Grandpa." Those words, so fragile, seemed to tremble in the air between you, yet they landed with the weight of years, years of dismissive glances, rolled eyes, careless phrases that had chipped away at your dignity in your own home. For a moment, you didn't move. You let the silence hold them, let the truth of them sink in, because this wasn't just an apology for a single word or a single dinner table insult. This was the first crack in a wall that had been built between generations. She stood there, shoulders lowered, her face caught between shame and hope. She wasn't just asking forgiveness. She was confessing that she had been blind. All this time, she had believed the world had moved past you, that your days of meaning had ended before hers had even begun. Now, after seeing your name shining in the gym, after hearing her coach speak of you not as a ghost but as a legend, She realized that what she dismissed as the past was in fact the foundation beneath her present. The apology was clumsy, unpolished, the way a child might return home after wandering too far in the dark. Yet it was real. You saw it in her eyes, the trembling recognition that the man she mocked was the man whose strength she carried in her very veins. She wasn't apologizing just to ease her guilt. She was apologizing because the truth had shaken her awake. And sometimes, the smallest "I'm sorry" is not a weakness, but the bravest step a person can take. You felt a storm break inside you, not of anger, not of revenge, but of release. For so long you had swallowed the bitterness of being forgotten, of watching your own family treat your years of sweat and sacrifice as if they were dust. And now, in those 2 words, something shifted. She saw you, not as just an old man, not as someone clinging to stories no one cared about. She saw you as you had always been, the fighter, the athlete, the champion whose photo on the wall was more than a relic. It was a living reminder that glory never dies. It only waits to be remembered. You didn't rush to embrace her. You didn't drown her in reassurances. That would come later. For now, the moment needed its weight. For her, saying those words was the beginning of humility. For you, hearing them was the beginning of healing. And together, in that fragile silence, something long broken began to mend. The first apology is never just about the past. It is the key that unlocks the future. And that night, in the quiet corner of your home, with no audience, no applause, just the trembling voice of your granddaughter, the world tilted back toward justice. It began like a ripple, small, almost invisible at first. A teacher mentioning your name in passing. A parent recalling a headline from decades ago. A neighbor nodding, as if finally remembering the man who once carried a whole team on his shoulders. Then it grew, spreading wider, louder, until the silence that had once buried your story could no longer hold it. The very voices that had once dismissed you, the ones that had chosen quiet over defense, now found themselves speaking, too late perhaps, but still speaking. They said he was the best. They said he played like no one else. They said the words that had lived in whispers for years, as if suddenly the truth had been dragged out into the light and demanded to be heard. And every time those words were spoken, the pride that had blinded your granddaughter, the pride that had kept her from seeing you for who you were, began to crumble. It wasn't anger or punishment that broke it. It was the unstoppable flood of truth. Your photo, once just a fading relic on a dusty wall, became a point of reverence. Students who had never met you now spoke your name with awe. Coaches pointed to your face, not as a memory, but as a standard. And those who once saw you only as an old man sitting quietly at family dinners realized they had been sitting in the presence of history itself. But for you, the justice wasn't in the applause. It was in the shift of silence to recognition. For years, the weight of their indifference had pressed you down. Now you could feel it lifting, piece by piece, as the truth reclaimed its place. You had never asked for monuments, never demanded that your name be engraved in marble. All you wanted was that your story, the sweat, the struggle, the victories, would not be erased by time or ignorance. And now, that erasure was undone. Your granddaughter felt it most sharply. Her pride had been loud once, cutting through the room with dismissive words and careless glances. But now, her pride was fractured. She could no longer look at you without remembering the coach's voice, the whispers in the gym, the picture that bore your name in bold, undeniable letters. She understood now that the legacy she had once mocked was the very one others longed to carry. And in that realization, her arrogance fell apart like fragile glass, leaving in its place a quiet humility. The crumbling of her pride was not your triumph, but it was your vindication. You didn't need to lift a finger, didn't need to raise your voice. The truth had done what years of silence could not. It stood taller than every doubt, louder than every scoff, stronger than every rolled eye. And as the world spoke your name once more, you realize that sometimes justice doesn't roar. It simply waits, patient and steady, until the moment it cannot be ignored. When the president spoke, when the nation heard my name for the first time, those cracks widened into a collapse no patch could cover. The spotlight they had once stolen turned harsh, illuminating their borrowed crowns for what they were: plastic, fragile, laughable. They had to stand there and face the truth that their power was hollow. It was not their hands that carried bricks in the rain, not their backs that bent under iron beams, not their nights that froze in the cold winds of unfinished roads. It was mine, and without that truth, they were nothing but words dressed in expensive suits. Your granddaughter sits near you, not speaking at first. Her gaze lingers, searching, almost trembling in its honesty. She doesn't roll her eyes now. She doesn't look past you as though you are invisible. She looks at you, at the man she once dismissed, at the story she once buried in her own ignorance. And in her eyes, you see something you thought had vanished forever. Pride. Real, trembling pride. The kind that comes not from illusion or pretense, but from the recognition of truth. For her, the photograph is no longer just an image on the wall. It is a mirror. It reflects not only the strength of your youth, but the blood that runs through her veins. She carries the same name, the same fire, the same unshakable legacy. She finally sees that what she mocked as the past was, in truth, her inheritance. And that realization fills her with something far heavier than shame. It fills her with gratitude, though she does not yet know how to say it. And you? You do not gloat. You do not revel in her regret. You do not sharpen her lesson into a weapon. Dignity is not revenge, and justice is not humiliation. Dignity is the quiet lifting of the weight from your shoulders, the gentle return of what was stolen. Respect. Justice is the simple fact that the truth, no matter how long it is buried, will one day rise. And now, it has risen. The porch creaks as you lean back, letting the last light of day warm your face. Somewhere in that school gym, children are still pointing at your picture, whispering your name with awe. Somewhere in that gym, your story is still being told to those who weren't even born when you played. And right here, on this porch, your granddaughter's eyes are telling you what words cannot, that the man she once thought was just an old story is, in fact, the foundation of her own. You smile, not because you need the world to bow, but because the world already knows. They thought you were forgotten. They thought you were only memory. But you built something more enduring than walls, more lasting than cheers, more powerful than pride. You built dignity, and tonight it rests in your hands, whole again.